Welcome to Storytelling Animals, a green new podcast where we use books to make sense of the ecological crisis and think about how to move forward. I'm your host, Dayton Martindale, and my guest today is the Australian fiction writer Laura Jean McKay. She is the author of the short story collection Holiday in Cambodia, and most recently, The Animals in That Country, which came out in 2020 and won multiple prizes, including last year's Arthur C. Clarke Award for science fiction novels. The book is about a rough around the edges grandmother named Jean, who works at a wildlife park, a dingo at that park named Sue, and what happens to these two and the rest of the world when humans and other species start gaining the ability to understand what each other are saying. McKay also has a PhD in literary animal studies, so we talk about her book as part of a growing wave of novels that seek to give voice to other animals, and how these can encourage readers to recognize that humans are not the center of the universe, but part of a larger, in some ways scary and humbling, but also more wondrous world. We're both concerned about the massive violence inflicted on animals by our current economic and social systems, and hopeful that fiction is one means of awakening people to that violence. So that's something we'll discuss too. As always, please consider supporting this podcast on Patreon. We'll be holding our first monthly book club for supporters on Wednesday, February 23rd at 5:30 p.m. Pacific, 8:30 Eastern to discuss The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh. All right, now to the interview. Hi, I'm here with Laura Jean McKay, the author of The Animals in That Country. Thanks for coming on the show, Laura.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk about this book. So, the kind of the major instigator of the plot for The Animals in That Country is a flu that gives humans enhanced ability to communicate with other animals. And we'll talk more about what this communication looks like in a bit. But first, I just want to ask about the origins of your interest in writing about animals, because this isn't, from what I understand, primarily what your first book of short stories was about.
Yeah, I guess I was raised rurally on a farm with a family, a sort of fairly matriarchal family who were fairly obsessed with animals. I can't walk along the street with my mum now, and see a dog or a bird without her, stopping and clutching my arm. We have to
Mhm.
stare at the animal for a while, often laughing, like at the amazing, sort of laughing in wonder at the amazing thing the animal is doing, a duck
Mhm.
tipping upside down to get the little insects under the water and its tail sticking up comically. So they were always very much there. We never really called ourselves animal lovers, just sort of, but that there was such a huge presence. And I started wondering what would happen if we could communicate, if the language barrier was taken away and we could communicate with these creatures that we spend a lot of time with, that we rely on very much so as humans, but that we often disregard and have often quite violent relationships with. And this really came from some of the encounters that I was having, especially as I started to think about this idea. One in particular was very, very early on in the piece, so about 3 years before I started really writing the novel. I was on a writer's residency out in the bush on the outskirts of Melbourne in Australia, and I was going along a dark path at night, and I came face to face with a full-size male kangaroo.
Wow.
Now, a male kangaroo by themselves, in the wild, is often one who has been kicked out of what we call a mob, the sort of collective noun for kangaroos, and is off by themselves, and they're often considered quite dangerous. And this kangaroo was my height, you know.
Uh-huh.
So usually I should have felt quite afraid, and the kangaroo himself should have been quite afraid as well, because humans in general in Australia, will often shoot and kill kangaroos. They are killed even though they're a native animal. But we both just stared into each other's eyes and did a little dance to try to get around each other, and then sort of went along our way. And for a few days after, he hung around the house just eating grass, and then eventually he disappeared. I think he was quite old, maybe a bit sick. And I just started thinking, if I was on a dark path at night and a full-grown adult male human had appeared, I would not be standing there calmly. I would be,
Hmm.
grabbing my keys. Um,
Hmm.
it'd be fight or flight. And what an amazing experience to share that moment with a completely different species and share this sort of mutual, quite benevolent exchange. And then I thought, well, what would have happened if we could have said things to each other? And that really, really started to fuel every encounter that I was having with other animals, whether it was,
Okay.
pigeons on the street, an ant that crawled into the house. I started really thinking, well, what is actually happening there? And what is happening in this exchange? And what is the power dynamic between the two of us right now? And what do I do in my life, in my relationship with other animals?
Yeah, I think I like I said, I want to talk more about that communication, but I have a question about one other sort of encounter you had with another species, which was while researching the book, you went to a great ape sanctuary in Florida, and there
That's
aren't
right.
really apes who feature heavily in the book, at least in the final draft. So how did that experience impact the writing?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked about that. That was such an amazing experience. I went over because I was doing a bit of research into different animal encounters, and I became fascinated by the stars of
Hmm.
of TV and film, who are chimpanzees and orangutans, and what becomes of them. It was sort of a where are they now? You see those
Hmm.
exposés on Macaulay Culkin. So I was thinking, well, where are they now? Where is the chimpanzee who was in Seinfeld? Um, you know, where are these different stars? And I found out, through very little research, that often they're sent to be, once they become fully grown adults, they're too big to control. So a lot of the animals that we see on screen are babies or infants.
Hmm.
And they often get sent to be experimented on in universities, um, or they get sent to roadside zoos, which are pretty horrific conditions. And places like the Centre for Great Apes in Florida, and there are also other fantastic organisations, often in Florida, have created sanctuaries, often not open to the public. So I was lucky enough to be able to visit there as a guest. And they're these places, they're basically retirement homes for for chimpanzee and
Hmm.
orangutan stars. One of the chimpanzees who is housed there is Bubbles, who was Michael Jackson's ex old companion chimpanzee.
Wow.
And Bubbles' sort of flatmate is a chimpanzee called Ripley. And I had such a strange experience with Ripley because I sat down. So basically, you're in this place where there are enclosures. There's a network of interlinked enclosures all around you. So in a way, you become the the caged animal, and the
Uh-huh.
chimpanzees sort of roam all around you. It's quite an uncanny decentering experience. So that in
Uh-huh.
itself was incredible. And I was writing in my notebook, and I became aware that someone was watching me. And I looked up and I saw, how sometimes you just meet someone and you know that they're going to be your friend, and you think, wow, that person seems, I want to talk to that person.
Sure,
They
yeah.
interest me. And I was looking at this other being thinking, wow, I feel like I know you. And in that moment, we weren't a chimpanzee and a human. I felt like we were just two beings who recognized each other. And
Hmm.
that experience was so, again, just like with the kangaroo, it was so sort of uncanny and not one that I think we take the time to pay attention to. But because I was starting to turn towards this sort of inquiry, it really impacted me and my writing. And as you said, there are no chimpanzees in the animals in that country. But I feel like that moment, that exchange with Ripley, influenced every single encounter that we find in the novel. So
Hmm.
it completely changed the way that I had the human characters and the other animal characters interacting. That moment of exchange where you sort of look across the often not very big gap between yourself and a hairy or feathery or scaly other, and and reach out.
Yeah, I think that that gap and how big it is definitely something that I was thinking about a lot as I read the novel. So
Mm.
you've situated your book within kind of a broader landscape of what you call in your PhD dissertation fauna fiction. I really like that
Mm.
term. Could you just briefly just define that for us?
Yeah, sure. So I was doing a PhD looking at interspecies communication to sort of try to support the writing that I was trying to do. And I felt that there were terms um, through which we could discuss our relationship with the broader environment. And, eco-criticism
Hmm.
um, really looks at that. But at the time, and I think this is definitely changing, especially through the work of Graham Huggan and Helen Tiffin and a lot of other theorists, there is more of a focus on how we interact with the non-human animal world. But I felt that in fiction, particularly, we needed a term that showed that animals, as well as human animals, are certainly part of our environment, and of course should be taken into account when we're discussing ecological concerns. But that then also needed to be a distinct term to discuss what animal characters are and what they are doing and what we are doing to them in fiction. And it was
Hmm.
really just a way for me to be able to really focus in on that and say, well, what happens when a non-human animal character appears in fiction? I know what happens when they appear in film. I've got another theory that I'm developing called Chekhov's dog, where I feel like if a dog appears in a film, in a realist film, and you know that it's going to die by the end. Like that's because
Oh
it's a
no.
symbol. It's a symbol for
Uh-huh.
human meaning, and in literature, it's always like the dog is, symbolizes the man's loneliness and his troubled childhood, and you know the fact
Hmm.
that he can't form relationships, um, and and I think that there is a place for that. There is definitely a place for symbol and metaphor in fiction. Of course, that's how we write. But there is also a case for the literal, for the animal to be an animal in and of itself within
Hmm.
the fictional work, and to be a full character that is not necessarily an anthropomorphized character, though we can't help that, but is its own animal self as much as we can make it in human language.
Yeah, I think that there are sort of, broadly speaking, and you kind of distinguish between these two different ways authors can approach this. One is to make the animal character speak more in complete sentences, totally fluent in human
Mm,
language. Um,
mm,
and the other is to let them retain a little more of their animality, either their chimpanzeehood or their dingohood
mm,
in your
mhm,
case. And for whatever reason, when I was going into your book, I I what I knew was that a flu spread and people could understand humans could understand other animals, and
mm,
I was expecting those other animals to speak in hi there, I'm a dingo named Sue, just kind of complete sentences. And one of I think kind of the most exciting reading experiences was relatively early on. You find out that that is not at all how the animals in your novel speak. Without giving too much away, they communicate not only through the noises they make, but through the scents they emit, the positioning of their ears and nose and tail, their posture,
mm,
the set of their fur or feathers, and the human characters hear and interpret all this as messages in English, but
mm.
they're messages that are difficult to understand, like haphazard snippets of poetry or some sort of fever dream. I saw another reviewer or interviewer called them hallucinogenic haikus. Um, how did you decide what these animals would sound like?
Mm. it was a really long journey. And I kind of, I've said this before, but I feel like I was sort of wrote three books. I wrote, a gritty realist book about a woman who's going through a crappy time,
Hmm.
and has trouble connecting to humans. And I wrote a speculative fiction novel in which as a pandemic zoo flu enables people to communicate with other animals. And then there's this thread, it's not really a novel, but I feel like it's this thread that runs through, which is the non-human animal dialogue. And that needed to be treated almost separately and then sort of woven in to the text. And with early drafts, and I rewrote the thing completely about three times, definitely in that first draft, there was no animal language. And my partner, who's a Tom Doig, who's a fantastic editor and writer, said, this is I love this I love this talking animal novel, but where are the talking animals? They're not there. So then I had to go and and
Hmm.
write the thing again. And I realized I was just working through this sort of horror of anthropomorphism. And once I got over that, and once I acknowledged the fact that I am a very simple animal, I think all humans are. I don't have many abilities. I can't fly. I can't use sonar. I just have this thing called language, and that's my power.
Hmm.
So I needed to use that and embrace that in order to, engage with how the animals would speak here. And I'd had an experience where I'd been bitten by a mosquito on um, a writers festival journey, and it had given me a disease called chikungunya, which sort of rendered me fairly immobile for about 2 years. It gives you full body arthritis. I could barely move, strange fever dreams.
Hmm.
And I thought, if a mosquito, if this tiny, tiny little animal could could bite me and then give a lick, which just dominated me, my body, and changed my body, for years, if not forever, then that's an incredible thing. So what would a mosquito say? What does this
Hmm.
powerful animal say? And I realized they would say things in all caps on the page. They would yell, they would be joyfully screaming their intention,
Uh-huh.
and this mosquito loved blood. And so why shouldn't she, and it was a she, tiger mosquito, why shouldn't she just fling herself at me screaming, blood, blood? And once I had that on the page, that gave me license in my own writing to explore what birds would say. And so I played with italics for them. And then Dingo Sue, who is really the star of the book, because she lives sort of a dual life of being institutionalized in a wildlife park and also a wild animal. She speaks with many parentheses, so she always has this other dingo voice saying the opposite of what it seems that she's saying. And so I started to really have fun on the page, and and I and also to experience on the page what I feel I experience when I stare at another animal, which is often wonder, and play. And that's
Hmm.
one of the joyful things. There are a lot of terrible, terrible things in our interactions with other animals, but one of the most amazing and joyful things I think is that we can stare at each other with complete unknowingness and go into that space, especially in this world where we have to know everything, of just not knowing much and just going, what is that crow thinking when it looks at me?
Uh-huh.
Because it is really staring at me right now.
Right. Well, yeah, let's talk about the Dingo Sue and your human main character. Uh, where did these two characters come from?
Yeah, so it took me a long time to find Jean, who is the main character, human character, and the person who narrates the book. She was like a guy who just sat on a couch watching a cat walk past him for a while. She was a cat. She went through a lot of iterations,
Hmm.
maybe 100,000 words. And then I was actually reading an Ottessa Moshfegh um, short story called Bettering Oneself, I think it is. And it's about a school teacher who has a alcohol reliance problem, but sort of maintains it and manages to be a teacher and go along and sort of impress and horrify the staff and students. And I
Hmm.
just thought, what a freeing character. And at the time, because I was so sick, I really couldn't drink anymore, and I'd been quite a joyful beer drinker. And so I sort of put that, I gave Jean my beer drinking, except she's, a lot more reliant on it than I am because she's going mostly through a very hard time. And once she sort of started sort of strutting through the pages, with a cigarette in one hand and, a beer in the other, all the while driving, that was just such a nice moment. But the
Hmm.
big change actually for me with Jean was in realizing that she was a middle-aged woman. The reason why I found it quite hard to find her, I think, was because none of the other characters could carry the weight of the animal apocalypse and the weight of this pandemic. And I thought, who is strong enough for this? And I
Hmm.
realized, a middle-aged woman, she's been through stuff, she's going through a bad divorce, she finds people hard. She's really, really tough. She's the toughest person that I could think of. She's the one who can bear this weight. And once I had her, then her granddaughter Kimberly came along, which was wonderful. But she still wasn't quite making sense on the page. I was still having difficulty with her when suddenly the dingo Sue appeared, and that was because I was living up in a wildlife park in the Northern Territory of Australia and spending a lot of time staring at dingoes. And once Dingo Sue appeared on the page, and I didn't really sort of think about her being there. She just sort of came on the page one day. Once she was there, she made sense of Jean, and Jean made sense of her, and suddenly they just took off together. They were sort of one of my friends has described it as a Thelma and Louise, you know, with a grandma and a dingo
Hmm.
type story.
Yeah, it becomes like a buddy road trip movie. Or
That's right.
um, yeah. So Jean works at this wildlife park. She considers herself someone who likes animals. She likes thinking about what they might be saying. So when she first hears rumors of this flu that gives people the ability to understand what other animals are saying, she
Mm.
actually kind of wants it. Um, she thinks, oh, this that actually could be pretty fun. Um, do you think you
Yeah.
would want it?
Mm. I mean, in a way, I felt like I had it because with chikungunya, with mosquito disease, I I became so delirious and my body changed so much and all the skin was peeling off my body because of the fever. And I thought the only thing that I could work out that was happening to me was that I was turning into a mosquito. That was the only rational
Uh-huh.
explanation for and then once I thought that, I thought, oh, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I can have a rest now. um, so I guess in a way I felt that that was a sort of a communication. Having said that, I I expressed this to my partner, saying, wouldn't it be quite cool if we could speak to other animals? And he said he's a very happy person. He's the happiest person. He's a very sunny person.
Uh-huh.
He said I would want to die, um, because they would tell us what we were doing to them. They would tell
Mm.
us exactly what they think of us, and I think it would be so awful that I would want to die. And that was so him saying that was so horrifying, and it made me realize how overwhelming it would be um,
Hmm.
if if we actually knew or had a sense of the other animal experience, especially where we're involved. But the other horror, I think, and this would perhaps be the greater shock, would be that we would realize how unnecessary we are largely
Hmm.
to a majority of the animal world. Except other than companion animals, maybe, and there's for and against arguments for that as well.
Hmm.
Pretty much any other animal in the world would probably be better off and doesn't really wouldn't be impacted by the
Hmm.
lack of humans.
Hmm.
And this really came to me, especially when I was up in the Northern Territory and there were these incredible sort of ant hills that are tomb shaped. They really do look like tombs. I'm not sure what sort of ants they are, but and
Okay.
they all sit in these arid sort of fields like a cemetery. But they are filled with these bustling cities of ants And unless humans come along and basically run them over, which probably happens every now and then,
Hmm.
they are not concerned with us. They are not involved with us. They don't care about us. They're just doing their thing. And that is so wonderful, but also I think quite confronting because humans are used to thinking of ourselves as the center of all and for all else that surrounds us, including other humans sometimes, for that to be there for our use.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting decisions you make in the book is when you start hearing about this flu spreading. There's some people who respond to it by becoming animal liberationists, and they break into farms or labs and let the animals free. And you and lots of people have said things to the effect of, if pigs could talk, we would probably stop eating them. But I
Yes.
the book takes kind of an ambiguous stance toward that, because on the other hand, there's people who hear their dogs start talking and kick the dog, close the door on their dog and lock the door.
Yeah.
There are people who just kind of get lost in conversation with an ant, and there are people who start scrubbing clean every corner of their house and lacing poison to keep the ants out. How the the net effect is sort of a partial societal breakdown, but how did you sort of think about what this would mean society wide?
Mm. Such a good question. I mean, I think I'm always interested in the nuance of any problem or quandary, no matter what my stance is.
Hmm.
Um, when I started writing the book, I was eating meat, and by the time I finished it, I was vegan. So I,
Hmm.
went on this, sort of intense personal sort of exploration
Uh-huh.
in what I was doing. And something that I think is so important. Um, and again, I bring up my partner here because he's very handy because he's a journalist and a non-fiction writer, so he's often sort of thinking ethically in the way that fiction writers don't always do Dutchwood. Um, and he's sort of says if you're going to turn the spotlight on an issue, you should turn the spotlight on yourself first of all, and that's really what I'm doing in my fiction. It's what I did in Holiday in Cambodia, I hope, and what I was doing here was sort of like, well, it's all very well to point the finger at all the bad humans and how we interact with other animals, but what am I doing myself? So I guess that's where that sort of slightly ambiguous stance comes from, because I wanted to think about the way that lots of different people would react to a certain situation, and that certainly plays out in the pandemic that we face right now as well. Um, some people react by hiding inside. Some people react by following every government directive. Others, especially people who haven't necessarily been able to rely on governments or police and things like that, want to react against that. Some people are using their fear and misplacing it or directing it in different ways. It's really fascinating to me, the different reactions that we are having, and also very disappointing.
Hmm.
Um, the way that we collectively as humans have really stuffed up our response, to this. There've been so many opportunities to
Hmm.
save vulnerable people that the governments in particular haven't taken up or have just been grossly incompetent with. And I think that was, playing out. Of course, I wrote the book before I knew what COVID was. It is in the response to that. It was written in the 7 years prior to that, but it was definitely something that I was interested in. What happens when you put a whole heap of people in this situation that isn't necessarily all bad, but it's not good either.
Hmm.
How do they react? What are they made of? Kurt Vonnegut says, in his rules of how to write short fiction, put characters in horrible situations in order to see what they're made of, and I think that's a good one.
Uh-huh.
But
Do
it
you
isn't
wanna?
necessarily
Mhm.
horrible either.
Mhm.
It's also this, as I said before, this moment of wonderment where not only can the characters stare at other animals, but the animals are staring back, and not only that, they are answering back. What do
Uh,
they say?
I do want to ask about, as I'm sure everyone does, what it was like to write a book about a flu pandemic, and then right before it
Mm,
comes out, the coronavirus outbreak began.
mm.
When I first looked at the release date for your book, it was in like mid 2020, and I was like, oh, that's a year and a half ago. That must have been before the virus. And I thought about it. I was like, oh, we've just been with the virus a very long time. Um,
Yes.
and so, yeah, how did you first decide to include a pandemic in your novel, and then did you end up making any edits when the real one broke out, or was
Mm.
it all pretty set by then?
Yeah, I mean it was very sort of mechanical, the way that the zoo flu was put into the novel. I basically I needed a whole heap of characters to suddenly be able to communicate with other animals. And
Hmm.
one of the best ways to do that is for everyone to get sick at the same time. Because otherwise you have, aliens or government conspiracies or, people tapping the water or something like that, but I
Hmm.
wanted it to be a little bit more organic than that. And I had worked in a previous life as an aid worker, responding in a communications way to the SARS epidemic. And so I did have a sense of how these things played out. Um, I didn't tell people when if I did ever discuss the novel with people, which I don't often do in the writing, I didn't often mention the pandemic subplot because when I did, people seemed to think it was quite far-fetched and how ridiculous and that's not going, even if this is a sci-fi novel, it seems a bit twee and that's not going to happen.
Uh-huh.
Um, so then fast forward to almost publication date, the book has gone to print. Uh, we're working out how, the marketing has sort of been done. We've had all these
Hmm.
discussions. And then these reports start to come out. There's an epidemic, there's a new flu. Oh, it's jumped the border. It's here, it's there. And I was flown over to Sydney to record the audiobook just as it was really starting to become a thing. And I got a whole heap of masks and wore them over. But I was going into an audio booth 8 hours a day and talking about, um, you know, governments, not handling things well in the book and supermarket shelves being cleared of toilet paper and fights breaking out and, people wearing masks and strange new symptoms. And then I would emerge from the audio booth to be in a Sydney where, so in that 8 hour period, the entire news cycle and the entire pandemic cycle had changed. And I'd go into the supermarket and there was no toilet paper and everyone was wearing masks. And it
Hmm.
was so uncanny. It was so weird. It was so scary. And I was so worried that, I would upset people because people were suffering, people were dying and still are. And I thought, God, I've written this book, this fictional book, and I hope that people won't suffer because of it. It won't make them feel bad. But as it turned out, I think it was similar enough, for people to be interested. I think, but different enough that they didn't have to go through their
Yeah.
own lives all over again.
Uh-huh.
And I myself found myself reading, I read Ling Ma's incredible book Severance, right in the middle of the strict New Zealand lockdown in 2020. I read it as a fantastic book, but also almost as a guide, like how do I deal with pandemics?
Hmm.
Please help
Interesting.
me, brilliant fictional author. And of course, then my entire life went online. I had a world trip
Hmm.
planned and everything, all the live events collapsed. But I became this sort of online talk bot who, who spoke
Hmm.
about the novel. As we all did. We all sort of turned very inward and went to our rooms and turned to our screens. It was quite strange.
So you mentioned that part of the horror that your partner had brought up at the idea of
Mm.
hearing what other animals were saying is thinking about what human society as it is doing to them. And you
Mm,
also mentioned that you became vegan over the course of writing the book.
mm,
So I'm curious just how this research and writing progress impacted how you think about other animals and the sort of political, economic, social relations we are in with them.
mm. Oh, it changed it completely. And that's what I want in the writing of a book. I mean, I've
Mm,
only written two books that have been published. I have, all those manuscripts in the drawer, but I think I don't want to go into a project that's going to take me years if it's not going to change me and better me in
uh-huh.
some way or make me see the world in a different way. That's why I'm going into this, because I've noticed something about myself that that maybe doesn't seem right, or it doesn't fit right, or I want to pick at it or explore it more deeply. And
Yeah.
so by the end of it, I'm probably going to be changed. I did an incredible course, back when I was writing my first book with the author Stephen Carroll, and he said, when you come out the other side of a novel, you should be physically and emotionally and mentally ravaged. You should be absolutely spent, because then that you've put your everything into it.
Hmm.
And I think that's true. I want to become obsessed, and I want to examine the problem from every angle. And I don't want to find answers though either. I want to ask questions. I want to ask
Hmm.
the hard questions, and first and foremost, I'm asking those hard questions of myself. And so you say, sorry, I didn't really answer your question. How has it changed my relationship?
Hmm.
Um, I mean, I don't, after writing a book like that and after doing a PhD on the subject and meeting so many incredible scholars in what we call animal studies, who are constantly thinking about these problems and asking these hard questions, I don't look at an animal in the same way. I do speak to flies and say, what are you doing here? I don't want you in my house. Like, who asked you here? You know, get out.
Uh,
But I also, capture them gently and guide them outside as well. Um, yeah, it's not, and that's not to say that I'm not a vegan scholar. I don't. It's sort of more of a personal thing for me. I don't really know so much about that area in terms of academia or activism, even though I've learnt from those people a lot, and it's really helped me. But I just think that once you start to take a step back, and decenter yourself, and realize that I am not the only being in this world. Not only am I surrounded by other
mhm.
people, but people are surrounded by this extraordinarily rich communicative, exchange, the slowness of tree communication, which suddenly everybody's, very excited by, and realizing, the amazing abilities and superpowers that other animals have in the celebration of their bodies and what they can do, let alone their inner worlds. The fact that they are born and they die and they live and they love and they hurt and they play. That's very exciting, and it's a relief in a way to stop being so obsessed with the human world, and to start to say, well, what am I in this place, and what can I do to change things? And I'm still pondering that. I don't do
Hmm.
enough. I'm a cis white woman living, in a as a colonial person in a westernized country. I'm
Hmm.
I'm the most, privileged person on the planet. I I don't do enough this space, and I hope that I will spend the rest of my life trying to work out how to do better, especially through literature.
Yeah, I think literature can help maybe not solve but work through some of those questions for the person who
Mm,
writes it, but also
mm,
ideally the readers. With the previous podcast guest, the wildlife journalist Emma Maris, we talked about at one point the potential for sort of having legally appointed representatives for other individual animals and species when there's legal
mm,
disputes and or city meetings on conservation issues, town halls or whatever.
Mm,
And I think books like yours and maybe other fauna fiction do a valuable creative task in helping people think, people who are involved in democratic decision making, which ideally should be more of us,
mm, mm,
in thinking about what other creature voices would sound like and say if they were in the room and if we tried seriously to consider their interests. So I don't know. That was just one thing that came to mind. But what do you see as something that not only your own book, that too, but also fauna fiction more generally, books where the main characters
mm,
aren't necessarily all human,
mm.
can what can those supply to a reader who maybe hasn't thought as much about it, or even if they have thought about it a lot? Because I think sometimes readers of books like this, it can take a moment to say like, wait, the main character's a dingo? Are you sure? Like, it's mainly like children's books or myths, but
Yes.
yeah, what can that bring to readers?
I mean, I think it can completely change your worldview. When I read Eva Hornung's Dog Boy, I didn't ever look at a dog in the same way again.
Hmm.
The same with The Sound of a Wild Snail Eating. I don't know how you could come out of that very short book, which is a non-fiction book. Um, I mean, there's not a snail I see now that I don't, escort across a treacherous a treacherous pathway.
Oh, I need to read that.
Suddenly you're down, and you are tiny with them, and you get to see the world on this very, very small scale. And literature has that effect. And anyone who thinks that words matter, and we're surrounded by words, so surely they do, must also believe that literature can change things in that way. And there are some extraordinary authors working in this space. When I first came into the space, people laughed at me when I said what I was doing. But of course, there were so many sort of writing elders who had
Hmm.
paved the way, and especially, of course, George Orwell, who, everybody says that Animal Farm is an allegory for Stalinism. Yes, it is, but George Orwell also says that it was inspired by seeing a young boy beating a giant pack horse, and relating that to sort of the state concern. So it's
Hmm.
it's like that thing that I was talking about earlier, that something can be both allegorical and literal, and
Hmm.
occupy that same space. Another incredible author is Suniti Namjoshi, um, whose work, The Conversations of Cow, is a metaphor. It's a metamorphosing. It's a conversation between a woman and a metamorphosing cow, and it's a love story. And it is just mind blowing. What she does imaginatively, in that space is so exciting. And another author that I really love, if people haven't come across her work, is Ellen Van Leeuwen's story collection, Water and Light. And there's a novella in there called Water, which is basically about plant people,
Hmm.
about Indigenous sovereignty, about love. It's the most mind-blowing story. So these are things that, these stories excite you, and they challenge you, and they pressure you to try harder, and to think differently, and to have different conversations. And also, the other thing about literature is that it's slow, and we live in a world that is just coming at us like a freight train, like a jet plane. And literature allows us to slow down and think. And it is slow to write, and it is slow to read, and we need that so
Hmm.
badly.
Yeah, so I want to ask two more questions that are get a little later in the plot.
Mhm.
So people who haven't read the book yet, I will I will add in edits how far ahead you should skip. Please skip ahead 7 minutes and 25 seconds if you wish to avoid spoilers. Uh, but so so first, I have to ask about the whales. So there's this kind of climactic scene toward the end where all these humans get entranced by this whale song calling them home, and many of them start swimming out toward the whales and end up just drowning en masse. Um,
mm,
I found this scene incredibly haunting and powerful, and I'm curious where in the development of the novel did
mm.
did this scene come into place?
Oh, it's so exciting to be able to talk about this because often I'm not allowed to because of spoilers,
Hmm.
but you've already gave a warning. So um so the whale scene came very, very early on in the piece. So, say it took me around, 7 years from, writing to publication of the animals in that country. The whale scene was so early on, and it didn't change very much. My editor and I did develop it a little, especially around the whale voices, but it was just very much there. And in a way, the rest of the novel had to try to, live up to that scene.
Hmm.
Um, I don't know where it came from at all. Um, I only know that I studied photography in the 90s, and I'm the worst photographer on the planet. But one thing that it did to me is it taught me about process, about the sort of a real passion for artistic process. But it also sort of changed the way that I saw the world, and it made me see in images. And so when I'm conceiving of a story, it often comes to me as a very clear image, and that image is often towards the end. So I got a very clear image of this bay and these whales calling out to humans. And then also fasting forward, I also got a very clear image of the ending of the book. And
Hmm.
so for the next sort of, 7 years, it was my job to get those images moving and to try to work out how do I get to that point? How does a woman and a dog end up on a beach with a whole heap of whales, that are talking to them? And more importantly, what are the whales saying?
Hmm.
And I also became really interested in the idea that whales were, at one point, way back in deep history, whales left the oceans and they sort of stumped around in this strange form on land for quite a while. And then at one point, they sort of went, you know what, it was great in the water. There was food there, our bodies were more
Hmm.
attuned to that environment. We're going back. And so in that scene, the whales are calling out to the humans, come home. You came from the water, come back. It's better here. We've tried it out. you know.
Uh-huh.
Um, so they're calling out quite sort of in quite a friendly way, in quite a helpful way, to the stupid humans who are still, stomping around on land, but not realizing that humans aren't advanced enough to come back to the water yet. We haven't we haven't rediscovered those skills, and so when the humans throw themselves in the water to be with the whales, they die.
Hmm. Well, one last question. I know you have to go soon, but
Mm,
at the very end, Jean gets a pill that or some treatment that takes care of the flu, and she loses her ability to understand Sue and the other animals. And
mm,
as chaotic and unsettling as having the flu was, and we talked about sort of the horror aspects of being able to hear all these terrified animals and hear their strange foreign worlds. But
mm,
when she loses that ability, I couldn't help feeling just this enormous sense of loss. Um,
mm, mm,
what what are we, as horrible as it can be to listen to the voices of the other world, of animal worlds? What
mm,
are we giving up when we just sort of think
mm,
of other life as voiceless?
mm. Yeah, I mean, we're giving up the whole world really, and we can see that through the climate crisis, through the extinction crisis. What we're giving up is the beauty of this world that we're in, and the horror that we're embracing the horror that we've created. And so in that moment, I did want it to be a moment of great loss. And I did, and this is the big cynic coming out in me right at the end. If I've been even-handed throughout the novel, I'm not at the end. I think that humans will always ultimately choose humans.
Mm.
And in that moment, Jean, and all the way through the book, Jean's a pain in the ass. She just does not listen to anyone,
Mm-hmm.
even the creature who supports her most, which is Sue, and who has stood by her and who is helping her. She she finds it too hard. It's a bit too hard to follow a dingo, um, and she chooses the human world. And I really think that's what we do ultimately, and that we have to try really hard. I think that is sort of innate in us to choose ourselves, and that we have to try really hard not to do that, and we can. And if we're so great, if we're as great as we think we are,
Uh-huh.
we can choose that, but it takes effort. And so that's what I'm doing right at the end there. I'm I'm showing I'm showing Jean and humans the extraordinary loss, that happens when we turn away from the non-human world, and make those choices. So, and that was a scene that was such a clear image to me.
Mm-hmm.
Again, right from the start, there was a woman standing on a highway with a dingo, and I had to work out, or with a canine actually. It wasn't a dingo at that point, some sort of canine, and I had to work
Mm-hmm.
out what she was doing there. She was losing everything, it turned out.
Uh-huh.
Oh, and one other thing I want to say about that is that, and I know Hemingway is very unpopular, but it was a little bit. I did draw from sort of Hemingway just because I sort of grew up as a writer with Hemingway,
Mm-hmm.
and his shadow looms way too large in the literary sort of world, but he was a big influence on me, and a lot of his stories I think are about a person who has nothing, who loses everything.
Mm.
That's the basic sort of Hemingway-esque story. And I wondered what would happen if that was a woman who who loved animals. What is
Mm-hmm.
it to have nothing and lose everything in that way? And in this case, she loses that connection with Sue and the other animal world.
Well, spoiler section over. Thank you so much for joining me. This was a super enjoyable conversation. And is there just anything else you want to add about the book or any of these themes we've talked about before I let you go?
Oh, it's just so great to talk to you. My trip to the States really, really did influence the book so much, even though, in a way it's a very Australian landscape. And, I'm so grateful to anyone who's working in the space, and, has helped me and other people to think through these problems. So yeah, thanks so much.
Thank you. And the book is The Animals in That Country. I'll put a link to the book in the description. And that was Laura Jean McKay. Thanks so much for coming on Storytelling Animals.
Thank you so much, Nathan.
Thank you so much for listening. And as always, if you enjoyed this, please feel free to rate, follow the podcast, and share it with a friend, a family member, or even on social media. Thanks so much. Have a good day.